Welcome back to those conversations on culture and belief, or questions on culture and belief. Today, the question before, I guess, us, but I'll say more Scott and Bruce, is, are sexual ethics relative? This seems somewhat timely. I mean, we have a Supreme Court decision not too long ago. Seems like sexuality, at least as a whole, is in the news a lot. It's in my Twitter feed a lot. I know that. So Bruce, how do we answer this question? How would a postmodern answer this question? Are sexual ethics relative?
Yeah, it depends on what postmodernist you ask. I don't think there's a monolithic answer to this, but generally speaking, it would be accurate to say that, at least with the postmodern philosophers, there's a deep resentment over any attempt to sort of create an ideal sexuality or an ideal sexual ethics code. There's things that I would say most people agree on, even in postmodernity. I mean, no one I've ever read is for pedophilia or bestiality. Those things still are seen as sort of dangerous. But as far as when it comes to like a consenting adult with other adults, really don't want any rules. And there are different reasons for why that might be the case, which we can get into later. But that would be the quick answer to your question.
And by so, I mean, obviously you have the ethical question. Is there be careful how I phrase this. I don't know like how much trouble I want to get into. Is there any scale in which there's like better and worse things for society, ethically, when it comes to sexuality? Like, say even like the nuclear family. Like, did they take something like that and say, this is ideal because of benefits A, B, and C? Does it mean that it's right or wrong? This other thing is wrong, but maybe this is preferred because of the benefits to society?
So on a macro level, that would not be the case. So because postmodernity does not believe that you can have a meta-narrative, a totalizing narrative on the human person, you therefore can't have a totalizing narrative on human sexuality. But at a localized level, particularly maybe at a cultural level, if certain cultural practices, sexual practices, are dominant in certain communities, then depending on the postmodern philosopher, those sexual habits and traditions might be fine to enforce there. For example, I haven't heard postmoderns complain about the Amish sexuality. The problem is when you try to apply Amish sexuality to the world or Christian sexuality to the world. So localized communities in postmodernity have the right to express themselves with their own ethical codes. It's when you try to make those totalizing that you get the problem.
Right. So this is the pushback against what is, I would probably not even perceive. This is probably true. Certainly it was for me growing up. The church or Christianity, it seemed like society as a whole felt like that Christianity was putting an ethic upon them, saying their ethic. Say that this is our ethic, and also we're going to place this upon you, and that's where the pushback comes in, and where they say like, well, you can't come in with that might be a fine sexual ethic for you guys to have, but you can't come in and apply that to society as a whole.
Right. That would be an exercise of power, and that would be an exercise of power in the worst way in postmodernism, because it would be an exercise of power for the sake of a totalizing rule of law. Mm-hmm. I mean, Foucault, for example, who we talked about last time, is deeply disturbed by the fact that the state, for example, would police bodies, that anyone who says they're for freedom can't really be for normative sexual ethics because it's for the policing of your body and other people's bodies, which for him digs down into the area where you should be the most free. The state should have no say in that. Generally speaking, the state should have no say in that.
No.
I have a couple basic questions here. why the still prevalent, as you described it, aversion to, something that like bestiality or something like that? I mean, is it just because of the lack of possible consent? You said pedophilia too. Is because of the lack of consent, and then that's an exercise of power?
Yeah, predominantly it's even more simpler than that. It's that any ethical, remember, postmodernism isn't anti-ethical. It's ethical at a localized level. So the reason why pedophilia and bestiality are generally seen as unethical is because they do harm to others. And in an ethical system, you're always weighing the pros and cons of every action and inaction. And so it's not that the act itself, whereas in Christianity, the act itself may be seen as against nature or wrong. And that's part of the reason why it's ethically wrong in Christianity, among other reasons. But you could say in an atheistic system, for example, that it's wrong simply because it does harm to a child, or it does harm to an animal, if you have an animal rights view. So there are different reasons to adopt ethical stances, moral stances within an ethical system.
It's interesting, and I guess I've thought of it like this, but not as specifically. I'm not so offended by the idea that within, as long as it doesn't seem like it's under attack, within Christianity, and for those that are Christian, that they live by sexual ethics that are given to them from the scriptures, and that within their community, that their community sort of expects that of them too. But that it would be very difficult to, and has shown to be very difficult to expect that of people that are outside of Christianity.
I was going to say that, Scott. I mean, I don't think it actually ended up, I don't think it served us that well trying to sort of police everybody else's behavior. That's never really served the church well, right? When we say, I know you don't believe the things I believe, but I want you to act like you do.
Yeah, and I guess I'm enough of libertarianish to argue that we probably should have never connected any of our civil laws to scriptural mandates anyway. In other words, say like laws regarding cheating on your wife or something like that. It should have, if that was illegal, it should have been illegal for sort of I guess for lack of a better word, I'd say protection from harm reason. I don't want to go to common good because that's got too much baggage lately, but sort of protection from possible harm and destruction.
Yeah. Well, there's where there's crossover is fine, right? So if the society says, "Hey, murder's bad," you're like, "Hey, we happen to agree with that too." It's all well and good, but essentially what we're saying, because I think what you see had seen for a long time is it was a sort of soft theonomy, right? That the church was interested in. They wouldn't come out and say it. Now there are some crazy people out there. Theonomy has made a huge comeback, but and those, you start messing with those people and it gets nuts. They literally want you. They think you should be able to stone your kid if he just crosses the line of rebellion one too many times. But
that ship's probably sailed.
yeah. But I think that there's sort of a softer theonomy that Christians for a long time engaged in.
Enjoyed maybe.
In
the U.S.
Where you're like, hey, I would love to legislate our morality, and you're like, that's theonomy essentially.
The biggest thing that's sort of disturbing to me. So I've never been, and this is going to get me in so much trouble, but I'm just going to say, like, I've always, let me say it positively, I've always thought that things like gay marriage, those are in the civil realm, those are civil discussions and ought to be decided by civil political discourse.
I agree.
But it wasn't something that for the American politic that the scriptures had primacy over. Now, I think for individual lives and within Christianity and the Christian community, that's a different story. But as far as like within civil discourse and the civitas, in the left-hand kingdom, these things we have a system in which these things are decided politically. Sometimes they're voted on. Sometimes the representatives that we vote to represent us vote on them. Sometimes the courts make decisions based on their interpretation of our Constitution, so on, so on, so on, right? But it's, at any rate, that's a civil political discourse. I've never had a problem with that. But what seems to be, what seems to happen that I think is a little more of a gray area, as far as Bruce has described it, is when sort of this postmodern don't inflict your power structure on me actually makes it into the conversations within the church too. In other words, even within the conversations within the church, oh, you can't say it's unethical for me to X, Y, or Z. I don't know, have, you know, I don't want to get too crass here, but, you know, be sleeping with 3 people at one time, whatever, all of whom I'm not married to, type of thing. And those conversations have made their way into the church. And the idea of, for this is lack of a better word, Bruce, I know it's not accurate, but sort of relativistic sort of view of this type of thing has made it into the church. If you, and you're a pastor, I have the, I'll call it fortunate opportunity to go to pastors' conferences. And these things come up, you know, and they come up in terms of like marriage counseling and like premarital counseling, marital counseling, youth group conversations, and they come up, and it seems like, you know, if the rule of thumb is that a community itself is allowed to have its own ethic, as long as it's not trying to impose that ethic globally on all other communities, that the line isn't that distinctly drawn in the minds of people that are influenced by this.
I would agree with that. And I share both of your general broad sweeping view that, you know, there's a left-handed kingdom and a right-handed kingdom being the church in the world, and that the church shouldn't necessarily want to create some political theophany and all that. I do personally struggle too, and I don't have an answer for this, but just, I find it a little more complicated in that the law that God has given is, you can look at the law obviously from a standpoint of accusation and justification and that relationship, but the law is also given some sort of order through the governing authorities in Scripture. I mean, they're given the sword, they're given these other things to help with.
We just did show on this on Thinking Fellows on Monday.
Yeah, to help with human flourishing. So where I struggle a little bit is that if the sovereign God says, hey, don't do these moral things, particularly in sexual ethics, because that's the topic, and then the world does them, then what is the moral responsibility of Christians who know that's not best for the world's flourishing? So now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that if Dan wants to link it, we just did a whole show on this on Thinking Fellows titled Church and State. And, you know, I think, first of all, Adam brought up the left-hand kingdom, right-hand kingdom discussions, you know, especially when they refer to how Luther spoke of those. We have to contextualize to our political climate because it's not the same as his at all. You know, his ruler was a Christian and saw himself a ruler within Christendom, you know, and part of his job was enforcing Christian ethics and norms, right? That was part of the gig. And it's not as much so now. And so when we say this, people sort of frame their mind differently. But what we landed on, and I think it's a good place to land, is that, you know, the church has a role here. Its role isn't necessarily to go be, as a church, politically active, you know, within the political centers of power as a church, and not as like capital C church, but let's say a small c church body, synod, whatever. But it does have a role in educating its congregants, parishioners, believers, as to what, you know, God's law says regarding these things, and thereby informing them, you know, how God intends for them to live. And part of how He intends for them to live is to fulfill their vocation as a citizen in the world, and in their particular body politic, which for us means the United States of America, and for most of the people watching this, I would guess, which means that you do have some sort of political responsibilities yourself. You vote for people that represent you. You vote on particular laws. You have rights here to protest and to write your legislators and to run for office and to, all these things. And I think that
and you're saying that on an individual Christian level, as opposed to
right.
your church coming going to
yes.
So see, this could be a very postmodern move, depending on wants to look.
What they need,
because you have your macro level, your normative macro level, which is the church, whether it be your local congregation or the Church Universal Big C, and then you have your individual localized level, which can act differently if it wants from this macro level. That's a very postmodern way of dichotomizing agency and action.
Can we call it something else, since I agree with it?
I think it is Stephen L. Carter, who's a constitutional law scholar at Yale. He writes often on the relationship between religion and politics. I believe he's Episcopal himself, but he has great books. One of the things he says is when you have a democracy, you can't ask people to leave their religious beliefs at the door when they go in the voting booth. So you can't. So, for example, if someone wants to elect Biden or Trump simply because they think they will institute a theocracy, like that's what they want, Carter would say, well, that's what democracy exists for. Like, it exists for that person to try to get that thing passed. So for me, it becomes difficult to practically think about this where we say on the one hand, well, the church, and I agree with you, I completely agree with you, the church should not be politically active and should not be involved in the public sphere in that way. But as individuals, you can enact all your Christian views anyway into the world
to the level of your particular vocation as citizen, or let's say you're a congressperson. I mean, to the level of your particular vocation as congressperson, right? You can. That's one of the things I said. You can run for office here. The difference is, our separation of powers within, sometimes even to refer to church and distinction between church and state, or separation between church and state here in this country. And I don't pretend to be a political scientist, although I really wanted to be one. But a theologian, what the heck? Why that? We sometimes as church people see this as a real thorn in our side, right? Because it means that we can't enact some things that we know are really, really right on a global political level for our country. But really, this is as much to protect the right of the church to preach the gospel too, or to preach the message, if you're a part of another church, that your church thinks it ought to be preaching. And the thing here that I think is really important is that we haven't really talked much about sexual ethics, which is probably good. But at the same time, a lot of the consternation that's popped up publicly by church officials and by pastors and whatnot has had to do with these issues of like transgenderism, LGBTQ stuff. And I'm not saying that the church can't help and shouldn't help, because it should. It's individual people learn what God has to say about these things, and thus inform them about how they act vocationally, politically. But I just think that it's too much to ask the church to, as a church, as an entity, as a body, as an administration, whatever, to step into that realm itself. Now, one of the good questions came up, Adam brought up when we did this on the show. He said, well, what about church-related sort of other, and we'll just call them nonprofits? Is it okay for a Christian to be involved in those things? And the one he brought up was Lutherans for Life. And I said, sure. I mean, yeah, that's not the church. These places come into churches and they ask for money and they fundraise and all that, and that's all fine and dandy. But that's still different than like your church as, First Lutheran Church on the corner. And your pastor saying, okay, as a church, we're going to Washington this week and we're going to do X, Y, or Z. I'm not even saying that that's necessarily wrong. I'm just saying in our theology, that muddies the waters between what the function of the church and the pastor is. And if you just go through the Augustana, I mean, it's clearly to preach the gospel and to administer the sacraments. You get much beyond that, and you're out on your own in a big way on what the function is.
Well,
And so
I think the confusion. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
No, I was going to say that I think there's a distinction that's maybe helpful. This is kind of the way that I viewed this, is that obviously Christians can be political.
And are.
But I feel like the church is very willing to give up its prophetic voice for a political one.
Yeah,
because what the church is supposed to speak prophetically to the culture.
Lord.
Yeah, but what it wants to do is speak into politics in a way that in a way that it's not designed to do.
Well, as though you said that this is a theocratic country, and that at the end of the day, that our political system is set up that at the end of the day, God is the buck stops here kind of guy. Now,
I'm trying to answer the original.
From our perspective, is he? Yeah, I mean, providentially, probably, but politically, no. That's not.
I guess I'm trying to answer your original reference to, it's in our churches, and you have the wider culture, and then you have the sort of pollution. You didn't use that word, but a sort of worldly, relativistic pollution that's influencing people in the church. And where it gets, I think, confusing in this conversation is that if we want to define the church in relation to politics merely or very narrowly as the corporation, and say, well, nonprofits aren't the church. Well, again, how do you want to define church? Church is the people. Church is the people. Church is the body of Christ. Church is the corporation. Church is there's different levels of church. And I think what I'm saying is that it's the reason why, and I don't have a solution for this, but one of the reasons why the pollution comes in is because the church can also make the mistake of kind of entering into a quietism, a moral quietism, where, and I share your fear of, it's so easy to be co-opted by power and by political conversations, and the gospel can get lost in that. And yes, the church has to be prophetic, but I think what you're seeing with younger generations, particularly,
there's not a distinction in their life between those things.
Yeah, that the church needs to use its prophetic voice in the political theater, and be more supportive of those types of things.
Well, it's funny. And Dan said it off camera, is that this is the most religious, irreligious culture in my history. Like, one of the things I think is interesting is you do see, I guess I'd say young people, that makes me feel like an old man, but that's fine. Young people sort of demanding that every entity, corporate entities, educational entities, religious entities, every entity take a stand for what they think is moral. And against what they think is immoral. I mean, we've seen this all over the place recently with every corporation on the planet saying they stand against racism and they stand for police reform or whatever, and this is new. I mean, I guess if you're 25, you don't really see this sort of corporate activism in corporate morality.
Do you think it's new though? I don't think it is. I think it's a reaction to the church's quieting down of that. I mean, if you go to the Middle Ages, the church told you what to believe about every single thing down to your...
I think it's new for corporations. Yeah, I do think it's new for corporations.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of, like, I remember when, this was not that long ago, and this is how quickly kind of some things have changed, is that you should drive me nuts when there would be religious organizations that would try to get you to sign petitions to boycott Target because of transgender bathroom laws, and you had massive.
Target trying to get you to boycott this product because they haven't made the right statement.
Yeah, and I didn't like it then, because I was all like, "Look, dude, like Home Depot was in the gay pride parade, so then you have the American Family Association deciding that no one's going to shop at Home Depot, And I'm like, look, dude, like I don't go for Home Depot for their political views. If I need lumber, and like that's where I'm going.
So
Yeah.
when I was I had to be 18 or 19, and I was going to church down the hill, or just down a little bit in Lake Arrowhead, and it's a LCMS church. I had never really belonged to a what I would call sort of a morally driven LCMS church before. I'd been to just like straight law gospel, preaching churches. And I get to this church, it's connected to the camp that I'm working at. And this is right when NYPD Blue comes on, and right when Jimmy Smits joins the cast after David Caruso gets canned for wanting more money. And so Jimmy Smits joins the cast. He hooks up with Kim Delaney, who's one of the other cops. And there's these scenes where we see Jimmy Smits' shining booty naked walking across the screen with a nice view of Kim Delaney's side boob. And the Christianity was outraged that this would be on TV. And one of the big announcements after church on Sunday was that there's a petition out there that you could sign to get NYPD Blue off the air because of Jimmy Smits' butt and Kim Delaney's side boob. And I remember even at like 19 thinking, this is an odd thing for my church to be doing, because I'd never experienced that before. But this is sort of my
well, this is what I was saying, Scott, is that that's why when I said off camera, like I recognize this, that's what I mean by I recognize it. When you have, like, I didn't like it then. You're like, where there's all these moral demands and more being made, you're like, oh, I recognize this. Not and it might be fine. You might be right. But there is a demand, a religious demand that says like, you have to join this because it's right.
Not a moral, you're not living up to your own moral code, or you're not living up to the public moral code or whatever. And I think this is where this gets sticky. And the big point I want to make 15 minutes ago was that when we take Christ out of this, the problem is when we take direct revelation out of this, it's nearly impossible to land on what the code is. And so I get this thing where within a culture you can have the capital T truth code. Within Christianity, we can have that code. We know our source of authority for that. We know our direct revelation. It's Holy Scriptures. But when you get into society at large, all of whom do not accept your source code, which is the Holy Scriptures, this gets to be nearly impossible. Especially when it comes, like you said, Bruce, to sexual ethics, because sexual ethics have to do with the most personal thing you have, which is your body and how you're treating it. Especially if these are all consensual relationships and all that. That makes a lot of sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is how we got from there to here now, where we have all sorts of capital T moral truth codes being thrown at us that have no grounding in an agreed upon textual authority, and just seem to be the common will of the people, the somewhat common will of people, which is, I don't think 100% common. And so that makes it even more difficult.
So Foucault has an answer to that. This is actually his main thesis through all his works, is to try to answer that question you just asked, which is sort of how did we get here and where are we going? And for Michael Foucault, he did what he called an archaeology of history, and then later, as his thought developed, it became a genealogy of history. And what he found was, which I think is interesting, is that the problem is modernity itself. And he believed that the central premise of the Enlightenment and modernity was that reason was neutral and objective, and that knowledge was power. But where Foucault sort of had a breakthrough and has become popular in postmodernism is Foucault thought, yes, knowledge is power, but it's always the power to dominate. That's the thing that's missing in what people understand modernism. They don't recognize this.
Still think that reason is objective?
No, he doesn't think it's objective. So, for example, he had studied to be a psychologist for a while, and then decided to become a philosopher. And so he had worked with mental asylums as like an intern and stuff when he was doing one of his degrees. And this was his awakening, because he recognized that madness, being the opposite of reason, is the thing that modernity is always trying to eradicate. Chaos and madness. And he was particularly disturbed by how modernity gets rid of madness. Modernity gets rid of madness by systemization. It systematizes things, analyzes things, and therefore homogenizes things. By homogenizing them, it creates a hegemony, a central power structure, which then acts to dominate you at the very level of your thought and into the level of your bodies. And so
you get to raise the objection that this is all like, logical propositions stacked on top of one another. If reason's not objective and formal logic's not objective.
So the reason why the problem he has with reason is that reason wants order. The nature of reason is that it wants order and systemization. So madness is bad. Gay is bad at a certain time period. Anything that doesn't fit within the systemization, the homogenization of the dominant truth claims becomes a sort of madness, a moniker for madness, for chaos. And what modernity has been trying to do is to order chaos and to systematize it, analyze it, make it into a totalizing narrative. And in so doing, Foucault says, it is actually controlling you. It is a form of dominance and control, because by systematizing something and making it into a singular narrative, first of all, you eliminate all sorts of stuff you wouldn't even consider. But second of all, even to the things that you would consider, those are the visible things that then need to be policed. And so for Foucault, modernity is a project in policing and dominance on people. And that in order for modernity to sustain itself, the food it eats to survive is dominance, power, and control. And therefore, when you say, okay, so how did we get where we are with all these fracturing? Because everybody begins to realize they can't no one fits in any of the systemizations. No one fully believes their systematic theology. No one fully buys into all the stuff on the scientific and medical community. No one fully buys into anything a professional or an elitist says. And Foucault says, we all know this intuitively. Why? Because we resist the homogenization, because we have intuition, we have other things that are pushing up and fracturing that system. So how does modernity respond to those fractures? More dominance, more expertise, more systemization. And he believes that there's a violence inherent in this. That there's a violence, there's a thought violence, there's a bio violence because it polices our bodies, and then there's a thought violence. And so what Foucault thought would happen is that eventually people would say, you know what, it's not this simple. You've lied to me for too long. I'm going to go with what I believe. And he believed even that, though, was still caught up in the modern project, but at least it was a sort of awareness to what's going on. Do
you think that there's an issue with even that, though, becoming universal? And that was my bigger point, is that what you have now, it seems to me, is a single set of thoughts, whether they be strictly emotional or reason or whatever, a single set of thoughts. Some of them seem like madness to me, to be honest with you. But a single set of thoughts then being imposed on a society as a whole. And this is where I feel like sort of the philosophy and the way that this works itself out in society just don't match. You have you can see some of what you're saying playing itself out every day on the news. If you just turn it on and watch it, or I'm sure if you're into Twitter or whatever, I'm sure there too. But it's become universal again, especially some of these issues, right, have become universal again. And they're not, the problem I have is that they don't, like I said, the base upon which we're believing and promoting these new ideas isn't revealed to me, and I don't understand it. Even ones that I totally agree with, things like anti-racism, totally agree with. But from the modern context, I I understand my basis for totally agree with it. It's, it's eminently scriptural, and it eminently has to do with what my responsibility is towards my neighbor, and how to treat them, and even how to think about them. So I get my basis for it, but I don't get a basis for it from people that don't have that sort of universal checkpoint to know why. I don't understand it, to be honest with you. And it seems like it's just harm, much like the pedophilia thing. I don't understand why harm is our point. Like how do we stay there without a more objective source point? And I think this is where this is where this gets the hardest, because I don't object to all of it by a long shot. I even agree with some of those things, those propositions concerning modernism. I think when he gets into, it seems like I'd have to read it, but it seems like from your description, when he gets into describing the difference between sort of reason and the other, reason is his primary tool to describe that, but that's fine. I mean, some of this just gets to be a little semantic for my taste, but at the same time, I get the concepts I think are interesting and not invalid, but at the same time, if you take it back to sexual ethics, right, there are some strictly held sexual norms, ethical norms, even in the unchurched population. And the Me Too movement brought those to bear, right? It's sexually normative not to, and I think this is a good thing, by the way, a very, very good thing, sexually normative now not to in any way coerce, use external pressure of any kind, somebody into a sexual act or relationship. That's good. That fits very well with the morality that I think we can get from the Christian scriptures. Absolutely. Again, also just vocationally, how I'm supposed to treat my neighbor, and even how I should feel about my neighbor, and how I should care about how they feel about our interactions, all of those. But I don't understand it completely from a, I guess I'd say, just for lack of a better word, atheistic point of view, where you don't have this final touch point. I actually get more a society that says we just don't know, right? We just don't know what's normative, because there is no normative. That makes more sense to me than your normative sucks. Now we're going to build a new normative on nothing. That's the one that kills me more.
Well, it's interesting what you said, Bruce, but Foucault seems like he's right about this, that I'm sympathetic to this, that if the people that have created the systems, so the people in power, keep lying to you, or you feel like these people are constantly lying to you, you know what, forget it, I'm just going to go act out what I believe because it's better
what
than
I
being
feel.
lied to. Yeah,
what I feel.
I think that's we've seen that, and I think it's understandable. Like, I mean, if you get lied to enough by people in power, you're like, you know what, I'm just going to do what I think is.
But how about the feelings becoming universal?
Yeah.
Well, and to be clear, what Foucault is most worried about is not necessarily what the ethics are. So he's not so much interested in trying to find a center point or a basis or a foundation for ethical thought. He's more concerned with how the argument for ethics actually plays out in modernism, how people justify telling other people how they should be ethical. And that discourse.
This is my question to you more than to Foucault. Is it, how do postmodern people, as they engage in society now, and they're engaging vigorously in society now, how do they end up telling the rest of us that a particular ethic is now normative for all of us? Because they do. How do they get to that?
Or is that inconsistent?
There's nothing necessarily contradictory in the postmodern argument about normatizing an ethic. It's the transcendence behind the normatizing of the ethic that's the problem, because that totalizes it.
Well,
so,
I think these are totalized. I guess you want to use that word, I'll use it. How did they get to from a philosophy that abhors totalizing these ethics to totalizing these ethics?
Or is that just not? Are they not actually? would you say that they're not actually postmodernist in that sense, thinkers, that they've abandoned
that's what I would like to know.
No, I would say that they would say that they're not actually totalized. That
Really? You don't think they would say that the racism isn't totalized, the sexual assault isn't totalized? I think they would.
They wouldn't say it's totalized in the sense that you can. So let me make a distinction here, which may help. When we talk about totalizing narratives in the postmodern sense, what we mean is narratives are total when they give an account for all things and close off attempt to close off any future systemization or deconstruction. This is the way science, Christianity.
That's exactly what's happening. To be honest.
But in the current milieu, they would say all you have that's happening is you have a normatizing of ethics in the Western world. They're not normalizing in Asia, so they're not totalizing.
They're being imposed on any public figure, and public can mean you are on Twitter, no matter where you are in the world.
Right, but
I think we disagree on this a little bit, and I'm curious when you say they would say, who's the they? Because my bigger point of contention here is that there's seems to me a wide crevasse here between the philosophers and the people using the philosophy. Now, that's always the case, I'm sure, but there seems to be a wide space here between the people who really thought about this and the people who became familiar with it from other people and are now trying to live it out.
So, for example, if we are, let's take the modern stuff with racism, for example. If we were to use Derrida for this, we could say that, again, Derrida's project, deconstruction project, is you have to rip down the hegemony, the one in power, through deconstruction so that the other can emerge. Well, in that movement of the hegemony falling and the other emerging, you're going to be promoting the other. And that's going to feel like a totalizing effect. But as soon as it actually becomes totalized, it has to be destroyed. I shouldn't say destroyed. They actually reject it.
I get that. Do the people doing the new totalization understand that?
Probably not, because they're not truly fully postmodern in that sense. They're modern, and this is the postmodern criticism on people who play with it. Because what people have done is they've latched on to postmodernism's sort of
light,
what they believe is the relevance that they like of postmodernism, to empower them to be hedonistic.
It's like me with their light.
Right, and to advance their own stuff without really taking the philosophy and this happens with every system, right? It's not, I don't want to, but yeah,
absolutely.
And they're using it, but like the postmoderns would say, even the idea of racism is itself caught up in systemization and needs to be looked at.
I agree. I'm more curious, because it's interesting to hear what the philosophers say, and then you look at the news and it's like, okay, you can see parts of what Bruce told us the philosophers say, and you can see parts of this that seem excessively modern and not postmodern, including the systemization of a new morality that's based in thin air that does seem like it's being promoted for a totalizing effect. And
when Foucault was pushed very hard on kind of how one could advance these different ethical positions in light of everything he had said, he gave an unsatisfactory but at least honest answer, and it's very simple. He said, you can sum up what I'm trying to do as respect differences. He thinks modernity, actually, that's the problem with modernity. It doesn't respect differences. It wants to homogenize things so that the differences all make sense within a system and aren't true differences in the
so I think when you said this isn't, the society is still very much modern and not postmodern, I think you're right, because I think that the new system doesn't respect differences either. This is the thing. Right. I don't need this video to be any longer, but this seems to be the thing with cancel culture, right? If you don't agree with the new system and or you act against the new system publicly or otherwise, you got to be canceled. Well, that's not respecting differences. That's certainly not respecting differences in systematic beliefs.
And that's cancel culture is just is a somewhat globalized technological hyperization of what modernity's always done. It's always canceled the outliers, and now we just experience it on a much more graphic.
We do it via
level.
social media so everybody can be involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Okay.
Woo. Okay.
Okay.
I'm not sure sexual ethics is a good title for this video, but just roll with it.
I'll just roll with it. I this is my takeaway. My takeaway is this conversation, looking at everything else going on, dude, there is no freedom outside of Christ. I'm telling you this.
Yeah, that's
this
a good takeaway, man.
This is.
Well, you can also see, though, and I really don't want to make it longer, but you can also see why certain segments of the church are really doubling down on views of natural law, because it's a way to, maybe, I think in their minds, a way to appeal to a source of authority that doesn't have to be named God and get an automatic reaction. Although I'm not sure that saying something is natural versus unnatural right now is going to get any better a reaction. But at the same time, you can see why this is being promoted pretty widely again, because it would seem like a useful tool when your appeal to God and or direct revelation is going to just be seen as just a cultural normative. But if you can say something is universally normative, i.e. this thing we call natural law, that seems maybe like a better approach. I don't think so, but I can understand. This is me trying to respect differences. I can understand their point of view.
Well, that's interesting that you said that, because we are going to be asking a question about natural law in the upcoming video.
Oh, good. Well, we'll save it for that.
I think that sexual ethics are the most challenging social issue for the church moving forward, just in dealing with its own constituency. And it's going to present a very deep divide and a deep challenge. And I think where postmodernity in its high-born sense could be useful to the church in this way is by, to appropriate Foucault for just this point, is to say, hey, what you've been told about sexuality by the world doesn't have a basis in a sovereign God. It has a basis in a power struggle of the world trying to systematize the human person into a certain type of sexual person that is itself not good for human flourishing. And I mean, I'm using philosophical language here, but I think that message needs to seep into our churches. And I think the temptation for churches is going to be, on the one hand, they're going to feel the pull to become politically involved, which for reasons we said earlier, and I fully agree with you, they need to avoid. That's very dangerous.
At least try to.
The other temptation, though, is to enter into a sort of escapism or quietism. We're like, just
learn
after come, Lord Jesus, we're not going to deal with it.
Yeah. I wasn't advocating. I'm not advocating for that. I'm actually advocating for
I'm not inferring that at all.
Over-education of your people in this area.
What the church needs to do is truly be prophetic. And I think just practically the thing that we need to do with, especially our young people, but everyone in our church, is we need to make them we need to make them have a confidence that the God who speaks through the scriptures really is the eternal God speaking to them, and that is the source of their hope for themselves in the world. And I'm not sure that the church has done a good job
with that.
In doing that.
I'm pretty sure the church hasn't done a good job of that.
And that lack of currency or that barrenness is now being felt in the church, and hopefully the church can renew itself to find that again.
When these things are taught as God speaking through the scriptures to you on these issues, you can also give the rationale of why God wants these things for you, why he wants you to be in a faithful marriage, why he wants you to even save sex for marriage, why he wants these things for you. And it's going to be because he loves you, and he loves the person that you're going to be married to, and he loves the family that will hopefully come out of that union, and he's trying to protect that. He's trying to protect you and those people that he's created and intended to, for the man to leave his father and mother and to be joined to his wife, and the two to become one flesh, and for that flesh to make other little fleshes, and you can give the reasons too. It's not just arbitrary. And I think my biggest fear with something like natural law as the basis for teaching this type of thing is it's rather arbitrary at that point too. You cannot, no matter what you think you can get from natural law, you can't get out of it that God does these things and gives you these things because he loves you. You can get that from the direct revelation that we have in the Holy Scriptures. And I think this is why it's so important for within the Christian community for us to stick to that and to stick to these being out of God's love for you.
Yeah, well, it could be just that that as you look at the pages of Scripture and you see what it is that God would have you do because he loves you is a better way to look at it, as opposed to taking those words and saying this is a great club to beat culture with.
Yes.
This is where the church slips up. Instead of saying this is God speaking to me about how I might order my life in the best way, because he actually does care about me.
You care for your neighbors in the best way. I mean, I remember telling my boys just straight out when they started dating that, you're likely not going to marry that girl, and one day she'll likely be somebody else's wife. So treat her like that. It's just like you want somebody is out there dating your future wife right now, and you would want that person to treat her like she's going to be your wife someday, out of love for her and out of love for you and out of love for your future family. And, I personally think it's just we too often use these ethics as a club with which to beat society, when it's, in the carrot and the stick mentality, we too often go to the stick when there really is some carrot out there.
I think contra the world, contra even Foucault in this case, we have a hyper individuality when it comes to our sexuality, and we do think our bodies are our own. But a key verse for me that I've long thought about as a sort of central foundational verse for sexual ethics is, you are not your own. You've been bought with a price. This is an idea of a body that's shared. It's the same idea of the body that's broken and given. Bodies in Scripture are communal enterprises. In marriage, bodies come together. David and Jonathan's souls are knit together. In the Last Supper, bodies are, Christ's body is given and shared. We become one bread and one body. Bodies are shared. And I think the church needs to recapitulate that message as it teaches its people to think about sexual ethics. We are not actually taught that our bodies are completely our own as sexual beings. People can't see, in Scripture, you can't see Noah's nakedness, and there's all this shared nature, shared bodies, shared nature. And as I think we begin to see bodies as God sees them, as not simply autonomous islands, but part of this entire thing called creation that he's died for and that we participate in. Maybe that will help us recategorize the sort of objections to ethics that Christianity holds, which is so often like, well, if it's just two consenting adults and they love each other and whatever, anything should be able to go. Well, that's not how the Bible sees bodies.
Yeah. Hey, we got to it, Dan. We should end.
There it is, right there. We did. We should. This is a long one. All right. Well, we'll be back next week with something else, man. These normally we record these videos when we'll do them in batches, and not these ones though. There's too much. Like, I'm exhausted after every one of these. So
yeah, I need a nap.
So, all right, we'll see you guys next week.
I've ever read Postmodernism too. That's been I need to give 10 pages. I need a nap.
All right, see you guys.